Hello, it's 4 p.m. in the world of Eastern Time on the internet. My name is John Bell, and I'm hosting this Ballard Institute Summer 2020 Online Puppet Forum number 6, Woman Behind the Shadows. I lost the title. Women Behind the Shadows, which is with Jennifer Goodlander, which is very exciting indeed. So as you may or may not know, this is a series of online discussions about different aspects of puppetry and puppetry studies that we started in early June when we realized we were stuck at home and wanted to figure out something having to do with puppetry. Why not take advantage of the interwebs and connect with interesting puppet artists and scholars like Professor Goodlander. So here we are. I'd like to thank, first of all, our Ballard Institute Manager of Operations and Collections, Emily Wicks, who's behind the scenes making things happen, and also one of our talented puppet arts program students, Elise Van Ass, who's been working with us since the spring and actually doing amazing work also online, creating and conducting puppet workshops, which you can see recordings of right now. And at the end of this event, I'll let you know the upcoming puppet workshops that are going to happen online. So although we're closed down now basically at the University of Connecticut in Storrs, where our puppet museum is located and where the puppet arts program is located, here we are online. So super awesome to connect with Jennifer Goodlander, who is in Indiana. And Jennifer is an associate professor at Indiana University in the Department of Comparative Literature, where she teaches classes on Indonesian and global theater, literature and other arts. She's also an active affiliate faculty member in theater and drama, folklore, and museum studies. And I think maybe she'll talk about this. Maybe you'll talk about this. Like, I think you started out in theater and drama and you switched to comparative literature. But I think that's super interesting because we're always noting how puppetry is this meeting place for so many different disciplines and so many different art forms. So it just makes total sense that your work is widespread. Jennifer has published numerous articles and 2 books, Women in the Shadows, Gender Puppets and the Power of Tradition in Bali. And then this book, Puppets and Cities, Articulating Identities in Southeast Asia, from 2018. She also contributed an essay to Women in Puppetry, which we talked about last week with Claudia Orenstein, an interesting essay about women and puppetry in Myanmar. So Jennifer's current research is looking at transnational Southeast Asian identities as expressed in performance, literature, and art. And she's also the current president for the Association of Asian Performance, which itself is of course, for puppetry studies, a wealth of information and work about puppetry, because puppetry is so important to Asian performance. So welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for joining us here.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
I know that we have a PowerPoint presentation to guide us, and what we think we're going to do is go back and forth looking at some of these, at the images you've put together in this presentation, and then talk about different aspects of your work. But maybe at the outset, maybe I could just share that as I was reading different chapters of Puppets and Cities, I was so struck by the kind of I don't know if it's unique, but it seems to be one particular and particularly interesting aspect of your work is the way that you're looking at a wide range of places, different countries of Southeast Asia, and looking at this question of identity and how puppets, ironically, perhaps to some, are so central to the creation or the recreation or the invention of identity in all of these different places. And for those of us who aren't scholars of Asian culture, although we are scholars of puppetry, it's so interesting to try to understand that, because of course Asian history is different than Western history and US history, and the kinds of experiences of modernity, one could say, including, I think, in Asia, the legacies of colonialism and also modern wars. Like I was thinking of the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia and their idea of instituting year one, eliminating all previous culture and starting all over. That's a sort of weird development of Marxism is in a way a super modern idea. We will start all over and destroy and recreate. So war and revolution and post-colonial situations are totally about what Southeast Asia is concerned with. As one could say, I think with Africa as well. But I was thinking about how fascinating your work is, because it deals with the particular situations of such experiences, such developments in many different places. So with that rather vague and pompous introduction, what are you doing? How did you get interested in puppetry and Southeast Asia and get to where you are?
I think I did my Master of Fine Arts at University of Hawaii, and I initially went to that program. I had reached that point in working in New York City as a director where to really continue to get work, you need a Master of Fine Arts. Applied to a number of programs, was particularly drawn to the program in Hawaii because of their program in Asian theater. When I was an undergraduate at Kalamazoo College, I took a class in Asian theater to make up one of my theater history requirements, and we studied mostly traditional kabuki and no and jingju and some stuff from Indonesia, and I thought, it's the weirdest, most interesting things I've ever seen. I have no idea what I would do with that. So when the opportunity came to immerse myself in more study of that, I found as a theater artist, I'm really drawn to performance that uses masks and puppetry and bodies to tell a story in very non-realistic ways. I also was taking and studying martial arts and wanted to find a way to bring that ethos of mind and body connection to my work. So in Hawaii, I finished there in 2004. I focused primarily on Japanese theater, and my thesis involved Japanese. No, I had a chance. They have some amazing collections there of wayang that Roger Long had brought, and so I had a chance a couple times for some projects to work with those, and they were just magical. But I didn't think puppetry would be my main focus. I learned more about Indonesia, started taking Indonesian language, went to Indonesia for the summer after I finished my studies in Hawaii, then worked as a freelance director, teaching universities, and decided to go back for a PhD, and went to Ohio University for the program in interdisciplinary arts, because I feel at its core, the arts in Asia are interdisciplinary. There's not this division of music, dance, acting, and even masks and puppets that we think of in the West. The programs are all cohesive. So I went to Ohio. They also have a really strong program in Southeast Asian studies, and my advisor who I worked with was William Condi, who I believe you know.
Sure.
And he had done some work with puppetry around Southeast Asia in a faculty program to kind of increase knowledge and teaching areas. So my second quarter there, I took his class on Indonesian puppetry. And one of the things that's sort of the hallmark, I think both within the study of Asian performance and also his approach to puppetry, is that to know it, you have to touch the puppets. You can't just look at them. You can't just read about them, but that by interacting with them is how you really know that. And I know a number of puppetry scholars, and I believe most recently I've read, like Dacia Posner talks about how the puppet, it misbehaves. It can only do what it's set out to do. So it's constant negotiation between the puppeteer and the object and the performance that can emerge from it.
Yeah.
I had gotten a Fulbright fellowship. A lot of my work in New York City was based in feminist theater. I was a women's studies concentration. So I wanted to find a way to bring that. My old advisor at Kalamazoo College had once challenged me when I went to go do some workshops for them on Asian theater. He said, but when you were here, you did a lot of feminist theater. How can you bring those two together? And I was like, I hadn't even thought of that. So I started thinking about that. And there were a number of traditional performances in Bali that used to be performed by men only and now are performed by women.
Yeah.
And so I received a Fulbright fellowship to go spend a year. The initial project was to look at many different arts, at dance, at Kachek, at the music, gamelan, as well as puppetry. I studied with Iwayan Tunjung. As I say, I think, Emily, there's a slide with a picture of him. And we started off just meeting several times a week, and then I was invited to give a performance and was asked to do the ritual initiation to really become a dalang or puppeteer, and realized this was my project. So I think I found something that was always a love of mine. I mean, I had even taken puppetry classes as a kid, was constantly making performances with my stuffed animals and objects. So it just seemed like such a natural fit. And I feel very lucky to then have realized this whole both artistic and scholarly community, and to really start doing and writing about puppetry at a time. I feel like it's also exploding here at home in the West. I was able to go, when I was at my first position was at University of Kentucky, I went and saw Warhorse. I was able to teach a class on puppetry there to the theater students. So it's just really exciting, and I keep finding more and more connections. I think one of the things you mentioned about looking at puppetry around Southeast Asia is, and I think I say this in the introduction to the book, and I often use it as a way to explain my work to non-puppet people and even to non-theater people, is that puppetry is one of the oldest and most important performing arts in Southeast Asia. Right. Contemporary Southeast Asia has recognized it as a way to maybe bring linkages among the different countries, because every single country in Southeast Asia has a puppet form, many of them dating back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So that just became a real interest of mine, is understanding how these forms, how tradition functions and is used by artists today, as a way to express who they are, and as it's such a unique performance because there is the object as well as the performer and the audience. So I also feel like, unlike theater, which is completely ephemeral, it has such a different relationship with history and culture.
I was thinking of that image of Iwayan Tunjung. Maybe we could discuss this for a bit, Emily. If we discussed, then that would be, we could, thank you. But it's my impression that that a part of a lot of Western and particularly United States scholars and performers to go to South Asia, and I'm thinking of Larry Reed or Matthew Cohen or Julie Taymor even, is undergoing this apprenticeship teaching in a particular form of and learning firsthand the nature of that form. John Amy, I think too, from Brown University, who studied Topeng. But how did that work exactly? And what is that relationship like? Do you, I mean, you met a teacher, you write in that image, but what
Sure.
what is that like? How is that different from studying with, viewpoints with CT Company or something?
Sure. I tell my students, especially as they're ready to embark on their dissertations, to sort of keep your eyes open and embrace dumb luck. I love to scuba dive, and I found as a scuba diver, you can swim, 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 trying to see everything, and you end up seeing nothing. Where if you hold still and let the fish come to you, you'll see so much more. And I think meeting Pak Tunjung was that kind of luck. I was in Bali in 2008, the summer before I was to begin my Fulbright. I had received some funding from Ohio University to spend 2 months doing some Balinese language training. I spoke Indonesian, which is the national language, but hadn't yet studied Balinese, which is the local language. When I got there a couple days beforehand, two members of the royal court in Ubud, which is sort of the key city for the arts in southern Bali, had passed, and the royal cremation, it was an auspicious time. It was a really auspicious summer for cremations. They were constantly going on. But it was, they had the royal cremation. So we got to Ubud about 2 days before that. And so we were watching the cremation, and these huge sarcophagi were coming around the corner, and they were too big to cut down. I got ran over and injured, and we ended up leaving. But a couple days later, they were still burning. So we went back to go to see them and started talking to a man who was watching. His name was Jaga. And he asked, well, why are you here? And I said, I wanted to study Kesenian dan Budayaan. I wanted to study arts and culture. And my partner, my now wife, was with me, and she said, oh, especially the puppetry. She really liked the puppetry. And he said, I know somebody you could meet. And I thought, well, I already know Inomian Sadana at the university. I feel pretty set as far as my puppetry contacts, but yes, you should always say yes. I would love to go meet him. So we made arrangements. The next day, Jaga picked us up. He drove us literally about 4 blocks down the street in his car. We got out it was in Pengosekan, which is sort of a southern part of Ubud. And I met Pak Tunjung. We sat down and had, warm sweet tea as you do. And he said, I will teach you systematically. You will learn how to use the puppets and to give them voice. We will meet 3 times a week. And little did I know from that summer, it would grow into really a lifelong connection and passion. I've been able to go several times and study with him. And he did start systematically. I was going to say, I have the Kayonan puppet that he made and gave me, and this is the puppet that can represent everything. Right. And we just started with learning how to make the figure 8s with it, and make it shimmer and look alive. And it looks easy now, but I'm always reminded when I teach it how difficult that really is. Mm-hmm. And spent a lot of time learning the voice. And I found at University of Hawaii, the program, we do kabuki and we do jingju. So I had a lot of experience doing what seemed like, strange voices and copying things in languages I didn't understand, which came really helpful in studying and learning the puppetry and performing it. So we sort of started at the beginning with the skills and learned a performance that I was then able to give. And I've continued to learn and add to my performance repertoire with him, but I feel like it was probably the luckiest day of my life when I got to meet him.
Well, maybe we could go back to the backstage image there, and which is fascinating.
Yeah.
And then I don't know if you want to talk about that. It's leading into puppets and religion, but
sure. I guess So wayang kulit, wayang means mirror and kulit means leather or skin. So the puppets are made out of cowhide. Right. It's a performance with one performer. So you can see in the center of the picture there holding the puppet is Pak Tunjung. As part of my study, I was able to accompany him, and I sat backstage and watched the performance. In Bali, most of the audience sits on the other side, so they watch the shadows.
Right.
You can see there are 4 musicians playing kind of a xylophone instrument called the Goodlander. There's puppets off to the side, and on each side of the stage sits an assistant who will help hand the puppets back and forth so the performance can stay steady. It's still in Bali lit by fire because the flame makes movement, so the puppets look extra alive, which is a really important aesthetic. And the arts generally, but wayang kulit especially, is it's important to religious ceremonies. And in order to have an efficacious ceremony, you quite often need to have a wayang kulit performance.
That sounds like a cue for the next image.
Sure, yeah.
Puppets and it's interesting hearing you explain these aspects, because and I'm not sure who our audience is. I know that they're fellow scholars and puppet aficionados, and those of us who've had the opportunity to develop some sense of understanding of Asian puppetry and Javanese puppetry and Indonesian puppetry in Bali and Java, have a sense of that puppetry and religion and ritual are sort of mixed together like that, almost inextricably. But did that was that a learning curve for you to connect with?
I don't know if learning curve is the right term. I think it's absolutely essential to understand Balinese religion, to be able to understand the arts. They're linked, but also that there's not a monolithic Balinese religion, just as there's not a monolithic wayang kulit. Every artist and there's regional styles does it quite differently. I realized that was one thing that really struck me when I was at Hawaii, is that we have a sense that tradition means unchanging, that it's been passed down from generation to generation, and it's the same. And in order for it to be authentic or done right, there is a sense that it has to have that sameness. And we were practicing Kyogen, which is a Japanese, the kind of funny no. And we had various teachers, all from the same school and family.
Right.
But one teacher would be like, no, on the line, you point and stomp your foot. The other teacher was like, no, say the line and then point and stomp your foot. And realizing that it's a small, tiny little difference, but that every artist has their own interpretations of these traditions is really key. But in Bali, the puppets are considered sacred objects. When you go through, a puppeteer goes through a ceremony to marry the puppets, and
oh yeah.
As I say, there's pictures of that. I had to, in order to really give a performance, I had to go through the ceremonies.
But now who? Excuse me for interrupting you.
Sure.
Are you marrying the puppets, or are the puppets marrying themselves, or?
It's marrying the puppeteer and the puppets.
Got it.
So it's creating a link between the performer and the objects that are performing. And in Bali, they talk about the dalang becomes a type of God, because he, almost always he, is giving the puppets life and voice and telling the story. And if in the story the dalang kills one of the puppets, the next day the puppet can be alive again. But also the performance is done for the gods who come watch the performance. But at the beginning of a performance, you give offerings to the puppets, and you also, there's an incantation for calling the gods to come speak through the puppets. So there's like multiple levels of God and human and puppet interaction happening that also seem contradictory, but they're all happening at once. And so the idea of marrying the puppets is that it's giving these puppets the power to be this kind of spiritual object. So you wouldn't typically, like the puppets you would buy at a tourist market would not be puppets that have this. The
Right.
older a puppet is, the more power through
Right.
performance they're thought to embody. So sometimes people would come and visit Pak Tunjung. They might be sick. They don't have enough money to hire a performance, but they will pay him so that they can just sit by the puppets and experience the spiritual
Right.
power that they
Mhm.
give off. The puppets are kept in a box that's locked in order to kind of keep them in there. There's
Right.
almost a playful sense that they'd get out and be naughty if you
What,
didn't put them under wraps.
one of the things that fascinates me, you know, having not experienced that and only sort of having a sense of it from afar, is my sense that for United States scholars and puppeteers to go to Southeast Asia or to Bali, as you've done, and to study,
Mhm.
and as what I'm getting from what you're saying is, and maybe we could discuss this for a minute, Emily, the this sort of immersion in this complete system which you've just been describing, which has so many different aspects and connects with religious life, and I know from your scholarly work, identity. And then when those American scholars come back,
Mhm.
they have this intense relationship, it seems to me, with the form, which is a little bit different from, you know, picking up puppetry in the US, where those deep connections have in some cases have withered. Like, I remember when I taught at Rhode Island School of Design for a very brief period, like John Amy, who I mentioned earlier, who's one of his areas is topeng, would come and give a demonstration of topeng masks, and he would, you know, and burn incense over the masks before working with them, because like you have to do that. And this is in, you know, with sort of hipster art students, and we're all modern, but all of a sudden, just the way John approached the work was completely defined what we were doing in a very different way. We weren't, you know, today in class, we're looking at blah, blah. It was, hold on, we have to do some work here. And I wonder if is that a disjunction for you, the difference between the, you know, marrying the puppets, as you say, in Bali, and then being back in Indiana and thinking about theater as, I don't know, you know, as something that's limited to what happens on the stage as a profession?
I think it's changed my relationship with what performance and arts can mean and do, but I think it's also still that type of relationship is still specific to the Balinese context, as you said, kind of in the intro. Since then, I've gone and I've been interested in even looking around Southeast Asia. But still, when I do something, when I still, one of the ways I share this work is by giving performances. And I don't do a lot of performing, but I try to once or twice a year have an opportunity to stay. It's helpful for me as a scholar and artist to stay connected to the puppets through the performance. But when I've taught classes with them, at University of Kentucky, I taught a class on Balinese performance, and we used the puppets a lot. And I've been working on trying to acquire a student set of puppets so that we're not using my sacred puppets for those classes. But also in Bali, there's the philosophy of desa kala patra, or time, place, and circumstances, and that things are very flexible based on time, place, and circumstances. And Hinduism as a religion is also very it's not monotheistic. It's very, very open. So I had the students at the beginning of the class, we had the puppets, and I had them all bring in something for offerings. And I framed it because, you know, we had it, especially in Kentucky, we had some very conservative students, and I wanted to honor their religion just as much as I wanted to
Right.
have them participate in this. And for me, it wasn't about, oh, that you're praying to a puppet god, but that you're honoring the work and the tradition and the lineage of our teachers and the craftsmanship and this training that has been passed down person to person. And I think that that's really important to take a moment and honor that. And maybe we don't do that enough. Maybe even like with Viewpoints or CD Company, and I know Mary Overly passed away recently. We should take more time to make sure we're really honoring those teachers where our training and who we are as scholars and artists has come from. I think perhaps I've seen more of that happening as we have been stuck at home and using social media as a platform to reflect and to connect with people in a different way. But yeah, for me, it's still important if I'm giving a performance or using the puppets in a workshop that there is a moment to give them that, for all of us to come together and think about that. Whether for somebody interprets that as part of their religious identity or not is not as important.
Maybe we should go back to the images here.
Sure.
That's super interesting. Let's see. I think we could go, do we want to go back to like interviewing women? I think that was the,
sure.
And then.
There we are. Yeah, that's Ibu Suratni. I write about her both in the book, and TDR published an article about her performance. So as I said, one of the things that took me to Bali at first was women are doing these traditional performances, and there's really interesting work that women are doing in gamelan and women's gamelan groups, and even dancing. Some women are doing the topeng or mass dance that John Amy does. I had found kind of glimmers where women were being puppeteers. And in the 70s, the UCLA had an arts program, and they brought over a dalang from Bali. And the first day of class, of course, there's women and men. And he went back to the administrators, was like, well, I can't teach women puppetry. Women don't do puppetry. And they said, well, this is the US. Women do what they sign up to do. So he taught them and realized, well, if women in America can do wayang, we need to prove that women in Bali are equal and can do wayang. So he sort of twisted the arm, forced his niece, who was a student at the university, to take up wayang. Her name is Ibu Trijata, and when I interviewed her, she really didn't want to. I mean, women don't go see the wayang kulit performances generally. They still happen late at night. It's still considered a very powerful, magical art form. It's not necessarily appropriate or practical for women to be able to go see the performances. And the puppets themselves are sacred. Women hadn't been allowed to even touch them before her study. And if women are menstruating, they're not allowed to go to the temple. So there was also a great deal of fear. If you have a ceremony, you have to have a puppet performance. What do you do if your dalang cancels at the last minute because she got her period? Or even worse, maybe she decides to lie about it and perform anyways. And that could be very, very dangerous. So there was a lot of angst, I think, from men and women about women taking these steps. But the university was sort of a secular space, and it was important to show that women could do this type of work. And so she did it. A few others were brought into the university. Probably the woman who still really performs is the one in this picture, Ibu Suratni. She's also an incredibly well-known drama gong performer, which is kind of a comic, more secular form of theater. And women who study puppetry in the university usually are doing it because they're really good dancers and performers, but they want to learn kind of the oral skills of a puppeteer in Bali. I always explain in Java, I feel like the puppetry is more of a visual art form. And in Bali, the emphasis is on the voice. It's a vocal art form primarily, first and foremost, and the puppets then support that. She's here giving a daytime performance, a Wayang Lema. It's considered more sacred. It is really just for the gods. I would go and watch these performances, and I would be the only one paying any attention. I write about in the article, though, that she did have more of an audience for this, and initially I felt like they thought the audience was there because, oh, it's kind of cool and unique that a woman is doing this performance. How interesting, maybe let's watch it. But as I kind of reflected back on the experience and as I learned more about gender and Balinese culture, I think there was also a likelihood that she was being watched to make sure the performance was done right, or that it was good enough. It was for a community cremation ceremony. So a number of people had family members who were being cremated, and you have to be cremated properly in order to go on to your next life and not be stuck on earth in kind of a limbo. So the stakes are very high for a cremation ceremony to go right. But there isn't like a continuing tradition. My dissertation kind of ended up with kind of because I was really trying to argue that there was an agency for women in doing Wayang and doing these traditional art forms, and that it was evidence of a change in society.
Right.
And I realized it's not. There is no continuing tradition. In spite of all of my efforts to try and find women performing Wayang, there aren't any. I was able to interview 5 women who had studied or performed it at some time. 4 of them only really through the university. One woman, Ibu Nondri, had become a dalang because her father was a dalang, and then her husband was a really well-known dalang, but he died early in their marriage in a motorcycle accident, leaving them with 3 children, and she needed to make a living, and the only thing she knew was Wayang, and she had his puppets, and so she was able to sort of take advantage of that lineage. So even though she was a woman, she was able to perform, and I think was quite successful. But as soon as one of her sons became old enough to take over, she really stepped back and retired, even though, and she says, I'm too old, I can't do it anymore. But she still works full time, selling things in the market, is quite spry. And there's men who are her at the same age as she is, who still perform. So I don't think that's all that's going on there, is that she's just too old and needed to retire. I think it's, well, now there is a man who can take over, and it's appropriate for me to step back and let him.
Claudia Orenstein writes, are there views about women who are pregnant doing Wayang Kulit?
I can't answer that. I think my sense is that women, when they're pregnant, it's kind of, again, like menstruating is a more sacred time. And so I would think that they don't. I never came across or thought to ask. There were women who expressed concern that they were worried by studying Wayang, because when they were in the university, they weren't married, that they would not be marriageable, that people wouldn't want to marry them. And then also, once they have children, that the time just becomes impossible. But yeah, it's a really good question. I don't have a very good answer.
I thought the way you were talking about your understanding of the situation of women puppeteers in Bali was really interesting, because I feel like for me, that understanding the situation of women in theater since you know the 70s or something has been this, maybe it's a modernist view that with you know, the increasing, the role of women can be recognized, can be foregrounded, can be studied, and that's a positive thing, or a positive change, or a positive understanding. And then it seems like what you're saying is, well, in Bali, it's not exactly working that way. There are women puppeteers, but that's not necessarily part of some, I want to say modernist, but maybe that's the right term. It's not necessarily a part of some advance of women in puppetry.
Yeah, I think it was on one hand, it was part of a modern project and an effort to demonstrate that, look how modern we are, women can do this. But I think after we've shown that women can do this, okay, well, we don't really have to keep doing that. And as I moved from revising my dissertation and thinking about the book and how unsatisfactory I found the end of the dissertation was, I think tradition means something in society, and having to account for, as I mentioned with the Kyogen example, that yes, tradition constantly changes, but how do we get then at understanding more about what tradition, or how people understand tradition in their own society? And for me, because women were an anomaly, it became a really useful place to interrogate that, and understand tradition. And same thing with puppets. I feel like I'm really indebted to the work that Mary Zurbachen and Angela Hobart did on wayang kulit in Bali. They both have really comprehensive, detailed studies about what the different eye shapes mean, and descriptions of, Mary Zurbachen was a linguist, and her understanding and capability with the different languages that are used. Because in a performance, the kind of main characters speak Kawi, which is an ancient Javanese court language. Nobody speaks it. It's sort of like going to to Catholic Mass and the priests are speaking Latin.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's these clown characters that translate the performance into everyday language, and so that the audience can understand it. And she was really able to analyze the differences and nuances of that in a really lovely way. But it was nice having these kind of foundations, and they both sort of wrote from the perspective, and I think a lot of the Balinese talk about wayang in this way, that this is the way it's done, and it's been passed down on and on and on. And I used the women as an interruption in my own experience, learning the tradition, to understand more, well, what do these different aesthetics really mean, and how are the judgment values given between a good performance and a not good performance indicative of how hegemony is working within culture. So it really became kind of a heuristic to understand more deeply Balinese culture, and I think in a larger thing, how tradition and gender function in cultures more generally. My hope is that it would be in conversation with people working on tradition in Africa or in other cultural contexts as well, but as a really case example. And for me, I kind of think of that work as a reflexive ethnography. So, and I, to a lesser extent, feel I insert myself in the Puppets and Cities book as well, but that my own experiences and my own interpretations and understanding of those experiences also must be made clear. And I think that that's a really useful and interesting and dialogic way of studying other cultures. For me, it's a way to sort of not be, oh, the all-knowing outsider who is going to tell you what this means, but rather kind of share with my reader the interpretive thinking that goes into my experiences and my study, and I'm taking both the emic and etic.
And maybe that this image that we're looking at of you in the ritual springs, I don't know if this is connected to marrying the puppet, but maybe that also speaks to this immersion in culture that your relationship with wayang brings with it.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, this sort of heads us into your book, Women in the Shadows.
Mm-hmm.
And which you've been talking about to a certain extent, but maybe could you talk a little bit more about what specific aspects of Southeast Asian, well, no, I'm sorry, you were talking I haven't read this book.
Sure,
You're
that's
talking
okay.
specifically about Bali in this book. So maybe this is just a continuation of what you're thinking. How did the the experience of writing this book allow you to crystallize your thinking about women in Balinese puppetry?
It did in many ways. As I said, I was able to really figure out what the argument could be, or what I really learned the year I spent in Bali. I also, while I was writing the book, was able to go back. I think I went back 3 or 4 different summers to continue learning new stories. The other part of the picture there is me performing. I believe that one is at University of Kentucky, but using performance as a way to share my art form remains really important. And I also feel, as a scholar, it's a way to reach a completely different audience who may not read the book, but may then become fascinated by Indonesia through the performance, and at a different type of experience. And the book goes kind of back and forth between the voices of my teachers, the voices of the women, and my own voice, and especially the section about going through the rituals. And again, to emphasize that this is my own experience and not that this is the one way this ritual is always done. The Holy Springs was, besides marrying the puppet, I also needed to go to 9 different Holy Springs. And the number was determined based on my birth year, my birthday, and what day of the week on the Balinese calendar I was born. And it was determined that that number was 9, which also was a very auspicious number because it has 3 threes. And so we needed to go to 3 different Holy Springs. The priest in that picture was the cousin of a friend of mine, the woman I was living with. He was the one who sort of took us around to those different springs. And I really was in the rituals as a participant without being told, well, this is what you're doing and why you're doing it. A number of the rituals had different things that you had to taste. And a few times he would even joke that you don't want to know what you're tasting, spit it out. And then here, the woman I was living with, Made, her mother was someone who had studied making offerings. And she was the one who designed and created all of the different offerings that we took to the spring. So it was also important to me that this is also a connection to a community and people, right, and that there's more than one person involved, and all right, of these different spaces and experiences became part of being a puppeteer for me. And I think that was really important to my understanding of how puppetry functions in society, as being a performance that belongs to the community there in a really unique way.
A question came in from Andrew Timar. What is the status of wayang golek, which are rod puppets? What is the status of wayang golek in Bali today, he asks.
Wayang golek is primarily a Sundanese art form. I was gonna say, Emily, the very last slide has me in a wayang golek puppet, so you can show people what that looks like if you want to bring that up. Andrew Weintraub, Weintraub at Pittsburgh, has written a really accessible, interesting book on wayang golek. And I've gotten to go see some performances and meet with some artists, but yeah, it's not a Balinese art form. Right. The one thing I learned, and I think what really fueled my interest in learning more about Indonesia and Southeast Asia more generally, I'm sure anyone who's studied performing arts in Bali can attest to the fact that it's so incredibly rich. It's a location you could spend your entire life. Yeah, so there I am with Chepat, who's the clown character in wayang golek performance. And you can see the other rod puppets behind me. Is that Bali's part of Indonesia. Indonesia has thousands of islands and hundreds of different ethnic groups. Each one has their own language and their own culture and their own art forms. And the Indonesian kind of national motto is unity and diversity, and trying to celebrate that diversity while also creating a cohesive Indonesian identity, and the arts have been a platform for that. But yeah, so that type of puppetry is part of Sunda, which is the western part of Java, although there is also a Javanese version of Golek. And in Sunda, it's still a dynamic, popular performance. The clowns especially perform, and there's several Dalang. A few of them have passed away in the last few years, but you have like just the Weintraub describes them as superstars that everybody goes to see them. They're like like the Michael Jackson of their area. And Bali has that as well. There's a Dalang whose name, he goes by Cenk Blanc. And you'll go to a performance and he'll use a huge kind of screen jumbotron of his performing with different screens and sound effects and a larger ensemble of music and shiny lights. And he's really, really funny. And there'll be 1,000 people sitting on the hill watching him perform. I realize part of tradition, the rhetoric of it is that it's disappearing, it's going to be gone, but we've been saying that now throughout the 20th and 21st century, and I don't think these art forms are going anywhere. I think they're going to continue to change. There's an ebb and a flow, but they are incredibly resilient and ever changing. I mean, tradition remains relevant because it changes, even if we're still understanding it as tradition. And I'm sure Matthew Cohen will talk about that in some of his work in Java as well.
Definitely. I wonder if we should look at like your study of Cambodian shadow theater or puppet theater. That's particularly fascinating.
Yeah, so as I was, this was while I was writing the Women in Shadows book, but I'm kind of thinking about, well, what do I want to do next? I had a friend from Ohio University who he had focused on Cambodia, like education policy or something, but he was in Cambodia and posting on Facebook, and I was like, what a fascinating, beautiful place. I wonder if there's a way I could go there. And I was really inspired by Beth Osnis's book on Malaysian shadow theater. And she has a chapter in there where she writes about the connections between puppetry around Southeast Asia. They're kind of connected histories and performance forms. I mean, they draw from some of the similar influences, especially in India, the primary stories of the Mahabharata and Ramayana. And I was really intrigued by that idea and thinking this is something that actually needs more research, and why not me? So I got a grant. I went to Cambodia. There's the Center for Khmer Studies, which is an American overseas institute, to go spend a summer learning Cambodian language and culture. And I learned about the puppetry there. Emily, if you want to go to the next slide, called Sbek Thom, which are these giant shadow puppets that are held and danced in performance. They tell stories of the Ramayana. I remember in Hawaii learning about Sbek Thom, and there's a similar form in Thailand called Nang Tulung, and that these art forms were disappearing. People are kind of holding them. They're not articulated. So there's people off to the sides who are singing and telling the stories. And we even had sort of a discussion in my class in Hawaii. Well, it sounds really boring. Maybe it's dying because it's boring and people don't want to see it. And I'm happy to say that is not the case. It's actually really dynamic and interesting, and is both in Thailand and Cambodia experiencing a revival. Of course, Cambodia, as you mentioned, the history of the Khmer Rouge and the attempt by Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge government to turn Cambodia's history back to year zero, and start all over and wipe away. So the figures differ, but between 80 to 90% of Cambodia's dancers, musicians, theater artists were killed. And things like puppets and play scripts and records were destroyed. So Cambodia is a country that is, the Khmer Rouge lost power in 79, and since then has been rebuilding and recreating. So there's a kind of both an invention of tradition and a Habsbound sense going on. but also trying to figure out what's important. And an artist, Man Kosal, had he was studying architecture, I believe, forgive me if I get the story a little bit wrong, but he kind of discovered this set of puppets and fell in love and started wanting to recreate the performances. And so from the research he could do, the people he could find to talk to, he learned how to create these puppets, how to perform the puppets, the music that went with them. He created a theater called Savannah Poem, which a few years ago was really struggling, and I write about this in the Puppets and Cities book, was really struggling to make it. And it was important to him to not only have a place for artists to learn and to preserve the art form, but also for, you know, for those artists to be creative and to pay the artists, even if it's just a little bit. Sbek Thom was made intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO, but it was not studied at the Arts University. So really, Savannah Poem and kind of a couple other little places were the ones trying to keep this art form alive. I was able to see my first Sbek Thom performance at the Seasons of Cambodia Festival in New York City. And it's so beautiful and dynamic. And the joining of the puppets and the people's bodies as they dance with them is so different. I was able to, when I was in Cambodia, then learning language, study with Man Kosal a little bit and learn how to articulate the puppet. It's incredibly difficult. When we started, he did say that typically women were not allowed to touch the puppets, to learn the art form, but this was his puppet theater, and he said women could do it, so they could. And I'd even met a couple other female students who had studied the art form there with him. Then when he became ill, those students, the two women, started creating a Facebook, kind of a real big social media campaign to invigorate Cambodian youth to rescue this art form. They called it the 5K Real. So 5,000 reals, just a little over a US dollar. And she said, you can use this to buy coffee, or you could save something that's part of your heritage. It was really successful. And I saw then on social media and in performance, Savannah Poem kind of changed from a theater that was for mostly tourists to all of these posts. More of their posts were in Khmer on their Facebook page, and many more artists and people around Cambodia taking interest. And recently, because of COVID-19, Man Kosal had posted that he was really sorry, but that he couldn't anymore, that the theater just couldn't survive. Rents in Phnom Penh had become so much more expensive, and the theater was going to just shut down. He was then contacted by the Ministry of Culture, and the ministry has decided to kind of take on these puppets and this knowledge and start really teaching it as part. It sounds like it'll become part of the curriculum, and the government is finally going to also take a step in preserving this art form. So I'm hopeful for that future of it, because Savannah Poem has really remained the one theater that has they're able to steadily keep performing and training young artists. I've gotten a chance to work a number of times with those artists in projects around Southeast Asia, and they're so dynamic and interesting. And so I hope that they are able to continue. I know Sandglass Theater had done an intercultural exchange with them a good while ago.
Right. It seems to me that with Cambodia, that the sort of the way tradition works is to try to recreate this tradition that had been stamped out by the Khmer Rouge, and so it's an attempt to reconstruct what had existed before, and that this is a little bit different from the way that tradition works with like some of the Indonesian dalangs you talked about, where they're bringing in, you know, big special effects, or as you write in Puppets and Cities, the creation of wayang that has to do with Star Wars, you know, that kind of modernization, or Sumarsam from Wesleyan University talks about, you know, rock and roll music in wayang.
Mm-hmm.
from Indonesia. Like it seems like the one is this careful or attempt to reconstruct, and the other is taking what's there and adding in all of these other maybe Western or elements that change it.
Yeah, it seems like I'd almost say almost every country I've been in Southeast Asia, there is a tension between maintaining a tradition and, you know, it not changing, that this is the authentic way it's supposed to be done.
Right.
And if you're doing things that are wrong, like even the artist in Bali who's super popular, Cenk Blanc, gets criticized all of the time for, well, you're not paying enough time to the sacredness, you're changing it, you're just going for the flash and comedy. But then there's others who also love that. So there definitely is a tension between kind of tradition and modernization. And I think that they mean something different in each country. I mean, like example
Right.
of Cambodia trying to reconnect and recreate these traditional forms. But I think as, at least in Cambodia, there seems to be a sense or a more comfort with having established a tradition or reestablished it, that then there's more room for play within that. I also write about in the Puppets in Cities books about the giant puppet parades that happen in Siem Reap. And
Right.
that's a really great example of even kind of foreign artists on the outside saying,
Yeah.
oh, wouldn't this be a neat thing to do in Siem Reap? And during the history of that project, really teaching and handing more and more of it over to the Cambodian artists and figuring out how do we do this, but while we're still honoring what's specifically Cambodian and building the puppets out of rattan and having youth involved in what the puppet characters will be and the designs of the puppets, so that there's a real fluid scale between sort of, you know, tradition and modernity. Or I guess in my teaching, I used to shorthand tradition versus contemporary performance, and I've gotten more comfortable with modern, especially because I think that there is emic uses of that term and very a conscious project of Southeast Asia creating their own sense of modernity. When I was a student at Ohio, I took a Southeast Asian history class with William Frederickson, and he began the class by sort of trying to upset that notion that there's the West and the East, and modernity is the West, and it's being infringed on Southeast Asia, but rather that Southeast Asia is constantly responding and changing it and making it its own, and that you have to understand that on its own terms. And I think tradition is part of modernity, but because there is an understandable discursive category of something that is tradition, I think that those terms are useful, but I always find that there isn't
Right.
any absolutes, and I've done away with worrying about whether something is authentic or not. I
Uh-huh.
find as a scholar, I'm really interested in sort of the discursive present on how these things are functioning and being talked about, and reflecting cultural values and identity right now.
The giant puppet project in Siem Reap is
Mhm.
really interesting to it's interesting to read your analysis of that, because it sounds like it emerges from it originally from the work of some Westerners, if
Mhm,
I'm
mhm.
not wrong,
Yes.
maybe an Australian. I'm not sure exactly where they're from, but from Europe or the U.S., and creating this a new form that, as you describe it, seems to take hold, and as you just mentioned, wants to be sort of handed off. And uh, it seems, looking at that and that image we were just seeing, it seems to me, you know, it's a very different form of puppetry than the kinds of traditional
Mm,
South Asian forms we've been looking at. And yet you're seeing it as also part of identity in Siem Reap, and sort of larger, I don't know, Cambodian identity.
mhm.
That seem, I was thinking there must be interesting dynamics in that, because here's these white folks, you know, like you and me, but white folks who are uh, entering into Cambodian puppet society. How does that work? Are there challenges with that?
Yeah, the year I really was able to spend a couple of weeks with the project. I helped with, there was just lots of hands needed to make puppets. So I was able to just be there all day long helping make puppets, and watching, you know, they were working with in Battambang. There's a performing arts school that was started by the French, and the idea that the arts would be a way to help people heal from the trauma of the Khmer Rouge, because Battambang is one of the villages. It's, I think, about 45 minutes from Siem Reap, that was really hit. And they now have, they're internationally known for their circus. If anyone's interested, and you Google PHARE, fair, the Cambodian circus, it's sort of a Cirque du Soleil style performance, but they also have theater school and architecture school, design school and art school. The Western artists started working with the school and training the young students there on how to design and build these puppets, and to, manage. They light up, and, you need to figure out how to light them up without setting them on fire. You need to think about the city street spaces and the power cords. So what are the sizes? Each puppet is sort of sponsored by a local school or youth organization, and the students help. They usually come in and spend a day helping build the puppet, so that they've had some hands-on experience with it. They march with the puppets. But it was interesting watching, the tensions of them trying to figure out how to communicate with each other. The Khmer artists didn't speak much English. The Western artists didn't speak much Khmer. They would sometimes have a good translator. They sometimes worked by lots of gesturing. But the tensions and the difficulties of trying to figure out that transmission. But I think a real desire to take hold of the project on the side of the Khmer artists, and a real wanting. Stuart, the one of the Australians who started the project, talked about, he's like, I didn't want to be the one doing this forever. I want them to be able to do it if they want it to continue. So it really shows, I think, both successfully and how messy, because I feel like sometimes in Bali is a certain case where people will come in and let's open an art studio for the Balinese, and we'll fund it for 3 years, and then we'll go away, and then you go visit it, and it's like this building, because no one knew, no one was given the knowledge. So there's a real sense of wanting to give the knowledge, but it also becomes a case of kind of also how messy and how great that can be.
Would Cambodian people look at this, the puppet parade you were just talking about, categorically differently from the way they would look at Sbek Thom, if I'm pronouncing, which is, has this, it has other South Asian connections, but it seems to be a Cambodian tradition.
Both yes and no. And I think Catherine Diamond does a good job of articulating some of the politics behind this, because Cambodia as a country has more foreign NGOs than any other country. And as part of recovery from the Khmer Rouge, has really depended, I think, almost to a detriment on international foreign aid. And so many of these arts projects rely still on foreign audiences, and that there isn't yet, the artists I talked to complain there aren't people who go to the theater. Going and seeing these performances are not something Cambodians normally do. That's one thing that the Giant Puppet Project would be unique, is because it's on the streets and it's in a space. It starts off in the touristy spaces, but then it goes down the streets and into the park, where that's where Cambodians hang out and spend their evening recreation time. So it kind of like visually and spatially shows that shift, and welcomes it. So a lot of young Cambodians do karaoke and watch Korean dramas and drink too much beer. Alcoholism is a real problem. So trying to create theater spaces and to teach audiences to go. That's one reason why I thought the project that the girls did with Savannah Pum and the 5K Real, and bringing in through social media young people to an art form and to a theater was, I mean, it's so incredibly revolutionary. People grew up trying to survive, so they didn't grow up going to the theater. So it's almost like there was a generational cutoff that's just starting to really grow. I love Cambodia because it just has so much energy and creativity and possibility, and I sense that among the Cambodian friends and artists I've worked with. But it's such a complicated thing that I think Cambodians may recognize Sbek Thom as this important thing that's part of our heritage, but it's not part of our daily experiences in the same way that they would recognize Angkor Wat it's on our flag, it's part of being Cambodian, but may have never had the experience of going there.
Frank Proshin comments regarding the giant puppets. There was already a Khmer giant puppet tradition like the European giants that was quite active at the local community level. They would stop traffic along the road and demand money for local relief projects.
Oh, wow.
But was that, I don't know if that was aesthetically different from the type of puppets that you're talking about, or were those construction aesthetics similar? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm unfortunately not familiar. If he gets a chance to maybe comment more, I'd be really curious to know.
Maybe we'll benefit from that. I've wondered if we should talk about your approach to puppets in museums, which is part of your Puppets in Cities book. Quite fascinating, of course, for me and for our Ballard Institute Museum of Puppetry and my colleague Emily Wicks, currently invisible, because we spend a lot of time thinking about puppets in museums. But you're thinking about, and specifically some of the museums, at least in Cambodia and maybe other places as well.
Yeah, as I was saying, that's a picture of the directory of the museum in Indonesia. So luck, I feel like, plays such a large part of what we do. When I was just beginning at Indiana University, I met with Jason Baer Jackson, who's in the folklore program there and was director of the Mathers Museum of World Cultures. And they had kind of a fellowship for IU faculty to move part of their line to the museum and become kind of a faculty curator. And the museum had a collection of wayang golek and several other puppets from Southeast Asia that he found especially interesting and would love somebody like me to come and work with. And so I applied and received it, and really received space to learn more about puppets and museums and performance and museums, and to think and experience that I don't think I would have had otherwise. I mean, of course, if you're interested in puppetry in other countries, you go to museums, you see the puppets, but I didn't really think so much about how they can really function in a museum.
So did you design this display that we're looking at?
Yeah, so this was sort of the culmination of my residency at the Mathers Museum. So this is in the museum. I taught a graduate seminar on puppets, on museums and performance, and we worked with the wayang golek collection. The top left photo you can see in the case, the wayang golek puppets. And one of our primary questions is, how do objects perform in a museum, and what's the relationship between the performance that these objects normally do and the way they're displayed in museums? The previous slide, or a couple other slides of museums in Indonesia, and what's typical is they're displayed as more art objects. They're displayed without much context of performance. They're beautiful objects if they're in an art museum, or they're cultural objects if they're in an ethnographic museum. So if you go back to the slide with down to, there you are. Each of the students, sort of in groups, had to learn about Indonesian puppetry in sort of a crash course, but then also think about, how do we make these objects perform? Especially without having a huge budget for all sorts of technical and video sort of special effects. and to display them both and thinking about their relationships to each other. We had then sort of a setup with a stage and a dummy puppeteer doing the puppets to show how they were used in
Okay.
performance. But the one on the kind of down corner left with the clown puppets was my favorite. So Balinese clowns have their mouths move, which makes them quite unique among different types of wayang in Indonesia. And I wanted the audience to be able to really interact with them. So we created a case where they had extra long sticks dropping down. And so the visitor at the museum was invited to be able to manipulate the puppet. And we even then had printed, like, here are some of the jokes or scenes you might do with these puppets, or kind of create and tell your own jokes with them. I always describe it that the clowns in a Balinese wayang kulit are sort of the mediaries between like this mythic past and the present, and they'll comment on, political events, who's in the audience, like very very local things, and they quite crude humor, but to kind of invite the viewers of the museum to have this performance experience with the puppets.
And that's what we're looking at now, I think, so people could control the rods from beneath the case to make the puppet. That's awesome.
Well, and also sort of thinking about working with the confines of a museum, because generally, and those puppets were ones I brought from Indonesia, because the puppets in the Mathers collection, of course, they're museum ethnographic objects, and you're not supposed to pick them up and start making them sort of talking and moving. They're there to be studied. So even kind of understanding the tensions between the function of what those objects do and how they're used versus in performance and as objects of study, but how can we kind of play or stretch or explore those tensions? And I always like going to the museum in Atlanta. Also does a really good job, I think, and finding different ways to display and have interactions with the puppets.
Well, someday maybe you can come to our museum and see what you find there.
Oh, I'd be delighted to.
We have about 15 minutes left, 14 minutes left. So maybe we should think about some of these other aspects of your work. I don't know what you might want to talk about next, and if we want to go to the, I don't know what you think. Sure.
As I say, there's the shameless plug for the book on Southeast Asian puppetry. So I started off in Cambodia, and I always say this book came from a desire to get to travel around Southeast Asia and experience more of the cultures and more of the puppets. Sort of my conduit for being able to do that was the ASEAN Puppet Exchange. So the Association for Southeast Asia Nations is sort of the EU of Southeast Asia. It's probably the easiest way to understand it. And Southeast Asia recognizes that in order to have political security, in order to have economic security, they have to create a cultural community. People need to feel like part of their identity is they are Southeast Asian, not just Indonesian or not just Balinese, but that there's this larger regional identity, and that the arts were used to do this. So several artists out of Singapore, an organization called Art Salute, led by Terrence Tan, had received funding partially from Japan in order to create these ASEAN puppet exchanges. And they began with a couple artists just meeting and learning about each other's art forms. When I joined the project, if you want to go down to the ASEAN slide, Emily, keep going, it's further down. There it is. This was the performance that happened in Jakarta as part of ASEAN Day, which is in August. And they had representatives from all 10 countries in Southeast Asia that are part of ASEAN. So that excludes East Timor, which is not yet part of ASEAN. But they had workshopped and created sort of a 20-minute performance. It is available on YouTube, tying in stories from the Ramayana in all of their different puppet forms. I was really lucky to be welcomed by these artists and invited back. I went with them to a number of exchanges in Brunei and Myanmar in Malaysia, in Thailand, where they would get together for a week or two, because they're all working artists. That's all the time they can afford to do this, but to learn how to manipulate each other's puppets, to share and develop stories. Some of the projects I think were artistically incredibly successful and dynamic, and some for the audience perhaps less so, but I think still such benefit for the artists to feel like they're part of this community. Of course, it's a theater performance. It doesn't reach a wide audience, but I think that there's been and continues to be, because the last performance was several years ago now, but a kind of a trickle down of artists sharing and caring about each other's work in a way that is beneficial. So through Apex, I was able to meet artists and then go to their different countries. I, as part of research for the book, went to all ASEAN countries except the Philippines. I was able to work with the Filipino artists in Vietnam, and in Myanmar, but didn't get a chance to go there. But it was really interesting to me. What are some of the similarities and what are the differences? And I also, the second part of the book, and cities, if we take this question of tradition and modernity, you know, you tend to think of, oh, kind of the puppet performance in the village and the rice fields, and it's traditional. But so many of these even traditional performances are happening in urban spaces. And of course, the context changes the meaning. It starts becoming part of heritage as part of, as rather a part of kind of efficacious daily life. And then there's artists who are creating new performances. The Star Wars that you mentioned in Kuala Lumpur, I think, is an example of that. So, and Beth Osnes writes about this in her book, that the wayang in Malaysia was in danger of disappearing. And these artists got the idea, they were really kind of more like animation artists, of creating a Star Wars, but using the traditional wayang. And they collaborated with a few of the Dawang, and created, kind of using the aesthetics of wayang, the Star Wars characters. They did get the blessing of the George Lucas estate. And so they've created, they have the music recreated as gamelan music. Again, it's fusion wayang. They have performed and displayed their puppets internationally, but it has created so much more local interest. And Tintoy, he explains it that, you know, he's like, well, no one might be interested in you know, the old stories of the Ramayana, but even my grandfather knows Star Wars. Star Wars is something that can appeal to everybody, and then give them a way in to this old art form, and interested in the other parts of the tradition, and not just Star Wars or Marvel comic heroes. So it's a way to kind of bridge a youth audience who sees himself as very global and very modern and very cosmopolitan into a traditional art form.
And it's interesting, at the University of Connecticut in the Dramatic Arts Department, in part in response to the COVID situation, they're going to focus on epics, or epic structure. And, you know, for puppeteers, it's so interesting how the epic structure of traditional, you know, wayang totally connects with the epic structure of Star Wars, which is now 9 episodes, and even the characters and the structures of each episode. So there's the interesting connections there, I think. So you could see how wayang could very easily connect with Star Wars. We don't have too much time left. You bring up so many fascinating aspects of identity and puppetry and South Asia in your book, like the idealization of village life and village culture, although increasingly life in South Asia is defined by urban culture, which is radically different.
Well, I don't know if it's defined, but it's the most growing area. I mean, and of course it's where money and political power is. I mean, of course, it would be incorrect to say large parts of Southeast Asia, of course, remain rural, but to see how even for urbanites, that's a huge part of their identity. And if you
Right.
kind of within city and geography studies, cities in Southeast Asia are among the fastest growing cities in the world, population wise. And even smaller cities like Phnom Penh, I found had like a particular type of urban identity. So
Mm.
I sort of group smaller cities like that together with Bangkok or Kuala Lumpur, which are really kind of mega cities in their own right.
And to the extent that puppetry, as we were saying at the outset, to the extent that puppetry connects ritual and identity and performance and entertainment, you know, and emerges historically from rural or village settings, puppetry seems like a kind of useful or natural way to bring back some of that if you're looking, as you're pointing out in your book, if you're looking to define or redefine identity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Here's a question that Frank Proshin asked earlier. To what extent does Islamic fundamentalism and intolerance threaten puppetry in Bali or Indonesia more widely? Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, Bali is more of a
It's Hindu.
Hindu, and then the rest of Indonesia or Java certainly is majority Muslim.
Mm-hmm. It does threaten, and there's fundamental groups who will complain that performing arts such as puppetry are against religious doctrine. I think the Malaysia case is probably the best documented of the tensions between performing arts such as wayang kulit and mak yong being forbidden by conservative Islamic governments in different parts of the country. But then there also being a contradiction that the national government recognizes them as cultural heritage. As I say, I can kind of speak of that peripherally. There's people who are actually really doing that deep research, but it's a fascinating question. And yes, there does remain attention, and Indonesian culture certainly keeps swinging back and forth in many ways of being both a very pluralistic society where the Islam that's practiced there is very spiritual, tied to some of these religious tradition, to these kind of ritualistic traditions that seem so separate from how we comprehend Islam, and then also different types of conservative factions and who are really pushing against those different art forms and ways of expression as being non-Islamic or and therefore non-Malaysian and non-Indonesian. And so there's an incredible amount of tensions there.
Mm. I maybe to close, I wanted to ask you about teaching and sort of tangentially related to puppetry studies, which we're all involved with, and to ask you, you already talked about in a way how you mix practice and history and theory together in your classes, but what sources do you like to draw on when you're teaching puppetry, and how do you define the puppetry that you teach?
Sure. I most recently taught a graduate seminar on puppetry and performing objects within the Department of Comparative Literature. So my own academic history, I fully moved to comparative literature this past year. I feel like it's more reflective of my training in interdisciplinary arts in many ways. It's also, I mean, just part of some changes that happened at the university and shifting of priorities within the theater department, that it ended up being a wonderful opportunity for me, because I'm interested in and have been thinking about, and even used the working group last year at Astor to think about, well, what's a puppet scholar doing in a literature department? And as I've pondered that question, I'm like, it's actually a really generative area. I've been really influenced by Terry Silvio's work on thinking about animation as a different sort of paradigm that might complement and kind of challenge some of the things that performance does. And I'm interested in even the relationship of a text between reading. I was I was going to say looking at Harold Segal's book on Pinocchio's progeny, and even though
Right.
he's dealing with a completely different cultural context, but there seems to be moments where puppetry is used in literature and it starts doing something different than just talking about characters. I mean, and why would an author even spend so much time describing puppetry?
Right.
So in our class, we read and discussed Pinocchio, but we were also able to go to an exhibit at the IU Art Museum before everything closed. Oh shoot, now I'm not remembering the artist, but he was a print artist and a performance artist, and he did a huge series on Pinocchio and visual arts, and also includes text in those. And there's Indonesian authors and even like just contemporary films. When I was in Indonesia last summer, I saw the horror movie Kuntilanak 2, and it's about kind of this witch woman character. But there's a really long scene where she has this wayang kulit set up, and the character, like one of the kids who she's trying to eat, are playing with them, and then like the puppets take over. So what is it about these, traditional puppetry that keeps capturing the imagination in different ways in Indonesia and these different art forms? And of course, wayang appears in hip hop and rock and roll and music videos. And so right now, a lot of what I'm trying to do and am excited about looking at is kind of puppetry and these other connections in different media. And for me, that's exciting. Being in a comparative literature department completely opens up being able to look at things that aren't defined easily, and looking at different categories of art forms, where I was really conscious in a theater department of trying to, how do I position this work as theater scholarship? I feel like I no longer have to have that argument with myself. And I feel like puppetry as an art form does bleed out of theater into other genres and areas of study in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, which is why it's so fascinating.
Yes, right? Like, I don't have to convince this audience.
And I mean, I'm interested that what you're talking about puppetry in texts or literature, because you have, first of all, so much global literature from Japan or India or Indonesia, or that deals with that's the texts of puppetry, the play texts of puppetry, or epic or Bible texts or medieval theater, or if you want to be real about it, Greek tragedy, which is mask performance. And then you have, I think, trying to write about puppetry inspires people to have to think about things differently than they would in other areas. So you get some oftentimes very interesting writing, like Kleist's writing on the marionette, or Plato's allegory of the cave, where he's talking about this object performance as a way to talk about real. So puppetry and literature, super awesome. Well, I feel like this week should have part 2, but we're sort of at the end of our time, and I really appreciate your sharing with us all of these different ways that you've been thinking about puppetry. I look forward to reading more of your work, and maybe welcoming you someday to the Ballard Institute in person.
I would be delighted.
Yeah, good. And I appreciate all of the feedback and questions we've gotten from the puppetry studies community, like Kathy Foley and Frank Proshin in particular, who are awesome. I wanted to say that as we continue, our next Puppet Forum guest will be next Thursday, July 16th, Penny Francis from London, who's been very active in puppetry there, and we'll talk with her. It was a translator of Henryk Jakowski, one of the great puppet historians of Europe. And then our online puppet workshops continue tomorrow with Elise Van Es doing a toy theater aquarium. And next Wednesday, Felicia Young appropriately doing a workshop on puppets for demonstrations. There's so many demonstrations happening now. And next Friday, the 17th, Elise will do a workshop on nature puppets. And the following Wednesday, the 22nd, Felicia will do one about crankies, you know, just a different type of puppet object performance with all sorts of global roots. This event that we're involved in right now with Jennifer will be available on our Facebook page, Ballard Institute Facebook page. Also, it will be available, as are all of our other online presentations, on our YouTube channel. So check that out. And I think that's pretty much, well, I wanted to say this. Speaking of the COVID era, if you'd like to support this event and our workshops and forums and performances, please feel free to make a contribution, a monetary contribution, as we say, to the URL that's appearing on the Facebook feed. That would help us a lot in the middle of the giant the world economic collapse that's happening around us, which no doubt will inspire a lot of good puppetry. I don't mean to end things on the note of caution or note of concern, but thank you, Jennifer. It's a great pleasure to have access to your wealth of information and your multivalenced and nuanced sense of puppetry in South Asia.
No, thank you for the opportunity. It's a great pleasure to get to share and think with other people. It's, I think, something we don't do enough as a scholar, and I plan on looking back over the Facebook feed, and anyone who wants to, feel free to reach out. But thank you so much. This has been a great privilege.
Great, wonderful. Thank you. Thanks to Emily Wicks and Elise Van Es for doing this, and thanks for all of you for watching, and come back. Thank you so much.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.